Yet another episode of the Anxiety RX podcast. Thanks for joining me and Dr. Megan Lyons today. Megan has more degrees than I can list, so I'm going to let her tell you a little bit about that. But we both had our own journey with high achieving and professionalism and going through mental and physical crises based on our own driven nature. So welcome, Megan. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here with you.
So jumping right in, how would you describe what you do?
Right now, what I do is work through a functional medicine approach to get my clients to whatever health outcome they want. So, for a lot of people, I specialize mostly in endocrine system. So, that's sex hormones, that's cortisol dysregulation, which maybe we'll talk about today, that's thyroid dysfunction, insulin resistance. Many of these things actually relate together more than people think they do. But that's kind of my bread and butter. I work with people all over the country, all over the world, really, on tailoring based on labs, based on their symptoms, based on their diets, their preferences, all of that stuff, tailoring a nutrition and lifestyle protocol that makes them feel amazing.
Cool. And what is it that puts you into this work?
Well, like you kind of alluded to, I I think I popped out of the womb as a high achiever, and honestly, I would not change that. In fact, I did one of those cool like brain mapping studies a couple of years ago and they were like, "We can change you." And I was like, "Actually, no. I'd
Mhm.
rather just learn to manage my beneficial sides and my challenging sides and
Totally.
keep it how it is." But that's how I was even from a young kid. Anything that was set in front of me, I just wanted to do my best, which worked out really well. Got to Harvard, studied economics there, had a blast, got a great management consulting job. And somewhere in there, I started feeling not like myself. I had, long story short, gotten into running because I saw this cute guy on moving day who's now my husband 25 years later,
There you
but
go.
he was a runner on the track and cross country team. And when you combine running with a history of anxiety and over driving yourself and undersleeping and all of this, it just leads to basic hormonal crash.
Sure.
So I went to a doctor back then and I was 24, 25, and I'm very grateful that she ran my hormones, which was pretty progressive back then,
Mhm.
especially
25
for
now.
a 24-year-old. And she looked at me and she was like, "I'm not really sure what's happening. Your hormones are lower than the postmenopausal women that I work with.
Hmm.
And I don't know what to do. So I can prescribe you estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, etc. But that's all I know to do." And that really started my journey. I was like, That's not wrong, but I know that I created this and I know that I can fix this."
Hmm.
So, just like anything, high achieving now for my own health, I
Sure.
really dove into the research and went on a journey of working on my own health. But once you feel it for yourself, it was just really hard not to share it. So I did go back to consulting after that, but eventually had to take the leap in 2014 and here I am.
Yeah, I'm kind of like that too. Typically, approaches to anxiety from regular allopathic medicine really miss a lot of the root cause.
Yeah.
Usually it's some sort of emotional wounding. I know Chris
Yes.
Palmer does a lot of work. He's at a Harvard as well on the metabolic aspect of, mental
Yes.
illness, quote unquote illness, and that kind. And I definitely believe that there's a metabolic component to it because we're either in protection or growth, and usually that's determined in the first 5 years of our life. Like 80% of our brain development is before the age of 5 years old. So depending on what kind of environment you grew up in that environment, you will either adopt this attitude that life is about protection or life is about growth. And protection is very metabolically challenging. Man, it's so hard on your system. So is that what you think happened to you? Like you just, burned out your system?
I think I did burn out my system, and I am extremely grateful to have not had a traditional trauma, so
Mhm.
nothing that you would look back on and say, "Oh, that was the one thing." But in my childhood, I was only praised for achievement. I only got attention really with achievement, and so I learned from a very early age that that's the only way that I'm valuable, unintentionally with
Sure.
very well-meaning parents, but that's what happened. And so through that, I have always struggled to feel like it's okay for me to, read a book on the couch or
Yeah.
something like that because no one would ever praise me for
Right.
that.
Sure.
And when I had all these stimuli around me, like at Harvard, there's no shortage of learning opportunities. You could learn forever, which I think is so cool and loved it about it. But thrust into that environment where I felt behind, I felt challenged, there was so much to do, and I don't know how to rest because I've only been praised for achievement.
Mhm.
I just drove myself straight off that cliff.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny how we get programmed by our parents, and well-meaning as
Yeah.
well. But if we also have that predilection to overachievement, overwork, I don't know if you have
Yes.
siblings that don't have that. My
Yeah.
brother is more, easygoing, watches sports page, loves sports, that kind of stuff. But I'm kind of like, I've got to figure this out. I got to figure that out. So it's funny how we adopt these programs from a very young age, and then they unconsciously just rule our lives until we become aware of them, which is what I talk about in my book. And I think that's what you talk about in your work too, is that just becoming really aware and focused on how much agency you do have in your own health.
Absolutely. I find that thought so empowering. It's never to blame myself or anyone else because, when we know better, we do better. But to know that I have agency over the way my mind works, even when it feels like it's spiraling out of control, that's
Right.
very cool to me.
Yeah. And I think that's a lot of what happens with anxiety is that a lot of my anxious patients had a lot of uncertainty and trauma in their childhood. So they avoid uncertainty at all costs. So what they do to avoid uncertainty is they go up into their head and they start to worry, right?
Yeah.
So that temporarily gives you a little bit of dopamine from that ventral tegmental area in your brain and nucleus accumbens and all these places that motivate us. So we actually get wired to worry. So we worry
Yeah.
more, which puts us in this defensive stance. And in that defensive stance, we never really learn how to be our authentic self because
Yeah.
we're always trying to either impress our parents or impress ourselves on some level or just achieve this impossible standard that we very rarely hit. So I'm not
Yeah.
surprised that, your hormones and all that kind of stuff went out of whack at such an early age.
Yeah. I'm not surprised either looking back. I was very surprised then, but now I get it.
So what do you do with people when they come in? It's like, do you assess their diet? Do you assess their lifestyle? Like, what is it you have? Like, what's your intake look like?
So it looks, I have the traditional intake form, right? That gives me a
Sure.
clue to what's going on based on what they report as their diet, they report as their symptoms, previous medical history, that kind of stuff. So I can tell a little bit from that. Honestly, though, I wonder if you relate to this. It's more of like once I have that first conversation, I have a pretty good
Yeah.
instinct of what's going on.
Right.
I can tell based on the person, not to say that everyone fits into a box, but you can tell based on the way they talk about their life if they are really under fueling or if they're just burning the candle at both ends or if they're super self-critical based on their language. It's a little bit of a different flavor for everyone. That first conversation though often leads me, and if I have uncertainty, I'll ask them, what do
Mm.
you think is the driving factor? And many times they're right.
Yeah.
So labs are really good. I love labs, but I think the person sitting in front of me is much more valuable even than the labs.
Yeah, I agree. I did a lot of my stuff as a medical doctor looking at sort of the scientific, dispassionate, you're supposed to be this dispassionate observer and that kind of thing too. But it was really like my intuition would tell me something. And I think that's really why I got out of medicine, just because my intuition was telling me something about this person and their labs may not reflect that. And often they didn't. And often it was more of an emotional issue that we would approach in a very different way because as we know medical doctors aren't that great at dealing with mental emotional illness. We're mostly we try and get into the scientific method where we reduce things down, and I think we're mind body spirit. And I think a lot of us, when we get trauma as children or even teens or adults, we go into this protective mode, as I was talking earlier. And it often doesn't show up on labs and it shows
Yeah.
up in behaviors. So just assessing, how fast do they speak? Do they give
Yes.
them it? Or, one of the things that I used to do sometimes is give people like a genuine compliment. and just see how they'd react to it. It's like, wow, you've got really like magnificent green eyes, and then,
Yes.
oh, well, I earned them from my parents. And, it's like you would tell if they make it a joke or they deflect it, it's probably they're not really all that willing to receive. And inability to receive is one of the huge sort of red flags that I would see with people. If you're always giving to other people and you don't accept to yourself, eventually you're going to burn out. Eventually. And that reminds a question I want to ask you is adrenal burnout a real thing? Because I see people kind of going, no, it's just this, it's kind of a colloquial term and it's not really real. And so it's just like I ask people, is adrenal burnout a real thing?
Yeah, it's a great question. Was it James Wilson who wrote the book Adrenal Fatigue, the
I think so.
21st Century Syndrome, something like that. It's a book that came out in the 80s or 90s or maybe early 2000s, but way long ago. And that book is actually really great. It has some great information in there. The problem was the understanding of the research at that time was kind of new.
Mm,
And so the term adrenal fatigue got appropriately vilified, where your adrenals don't actually get
yeah,
tired.
yeah.
It's more like insulin resistance.
Mm,
Your body is trying to compensate for this need to secrete so much cortisol over and over and over that our receptivity to it changes. So,
mm.
do I see some people with very high cortisol in saliva, blood, or urine? Blood, I don't think is the best for cortisol, but whatever. Do I see sometimes very high? Yes. Do I see sometimes very low? Yes. And is that low a reaction to being so high for so long? Yes. But it's not that your adrenal glands just got
Yeah.
tired. It's more compensation.
Right. Right. It's interesting that you bring up like blood sugar as far as that kind of stuff goes and how that becomes a compensation. Because I know when I have my cortisol tested, and I haven't had it done for a while, but 5 years ago when I was, pretty much in the depths of significant anxiety and alarm, I had the reverse pattern. So I would have my cortisol would bottom out at 7 a.m. and then at 7 p.m. it would be through the roof. So I had this
Yeah.
opposite program. So I had to learn how to deal with that, because I think if I had it tested today, it would probably have a similar pattern. It's not like it's completely turned around, but I know that in my family, like cortisol is an issue for sure. Luckily, my blood sugar is pretty good because I exercise all the time and that kind of thing too. But just interesting to see how one thing affects another thing. And this is what I talk about my perimenopausal patients with anxiety. They'll say, "I never had anxiety before perimenopause, and now it just flows." And I often will tell them, and maybe you can edify me this way, is that no, you probably did. It just probably was just below the radar, and then
Yeah.
perimenopause just tipped you over into that sort of thing too. So I don't know what you think about that.
Well, I think you're probably right. And the analogy that I use is a little silly, but it makes sense to people. So let's think about an orchestra. The violinist is the estrogen and the bassist is the cortisol, whatever.
Yeah.
Each hormone in the body is a different instrument.
Mm,
Now, let's say the violinist, which is estrogen, all of a sudden goes rogue. In perimenopause, we know estrogen sometimes goes higher on its way to really crashing out. It's very volatile during that time. So, if you're in the orchestra and the violinist is going rogue, what might you do? You might go quiet and like pretend the violinist is supposed to have a solo, or you might try to play louder to cover up the violinist. You might try to speed up to catch the violinist and make it seem like everything's supposed to go fast. You don't know, but that's what your other hormones are doing to compensate. So if the sex hormones are leading the charge and quote going rogue, then the cortisol, the all kinds of neurotransmitters are going to try to balance out
mhm.
that violinist that has gone rogue.
And then how, I don't know if this is, your area of study, but how do the antidepressants affect all that stuff?
So I will first say, I think antidepressants are wonderful medications when they're needed,
Hmm.
right? I was on them for 7 years. And at that time, I think it was a good decision.
Which one, Megan? Was it SSRI, SNRI? Which?
I was on fluoxetine or Prozac, so
Okay. Yep.
SSRI.
Yep.
And I think, look, right now I'm very grateful that I'm not and that I have the
Mhm.
tools to manage it otherwise. But
Right.
at that time, I didn't have the tools. And so like I said, very grateful that they exist. What people experience often on them, as you very well know, but maybe for the
I was
audience
on the
who doesn't know,
I was on all different, for 25 years, Prozac, Paxil, Luvox, and then the Effexors and all that kind of stuff. I did all of those things. And basically what they did, not to interrupt, but what they did was they
please.
dropped my anxiety from like a 7 to a 4. But they also, I didn't feel anxious so much anymore, but I didn't feel much of anything.
Yes. That's exactly what I was going to say. I think of it as like shortening the window or the breadth of experiences. So your lows aren't so low, but your highs really are not so high. You
Yeah,
just don't feel much at all.
right.
And humans are designed to go through a wave of emotions. We think of everything in balance when we think of like the homeostatic condition of a human, but that's not how it is. It's
No.
always fluctuating around some kind of quote arbitrary balance. When we don't have that, any kind of neurotransmitters that we're altering does have a downstream effect. So I very much do see that people who are on SSRIs, especially for a long period of time, they're more susceptible to hormonal fluctuations. It's not always the case, but it's a common pattern.
And what do you like? Do you help people get off these medications?
So, yes and no. I am not credentialed, nor would I step across
Right.
my boundaries to
Sure.
ever tell someone to come off of a medication. What I see as my role is to really support their neurotransmitter production through nutrition,
Mm.
supplementation, manage their lifestyle, all of that. And then they talk with their medical doctor or prescribing practitioner to work on a taper plan for that.
Right. So are there particular supplements that you sort of recommend for people that, struggle with anxiety?
It so varies
Mhm.
based on the person, but I would say my favorite class of supplements is adaptogens. I
Mhm.
really like adaptogens for their balancing power of neurotransmitters and cortisol. So we think of maybe ashwagandha as something that acts powerfully with cortisol. But if I don't know much about the person or they don't want to do testing for whatever reason, I'll start even more gently with something like Tulsi or holy basil. This is very unlikely to cause negative side
Yeah.
effects. Of course,
Yeah.
we always want to check medications, things like that, but this is like a really calming one. So let's just see how someone reacts to that. Maybe we'll do, of course, we'll do nutrition and lifestyle, but maybe we'll also do some other, like give them a multivitamin, magnesium L-threonate to cross the blood-brain barrier, something really soothing like that. And then let's see, once we know how they react, let's go further.
Hmm. So do you have a particular kind of patient profile that you really love to work with? Like for me, I really love to work with people who are motivated. It's like people typically when they come to me, they've tried everything. People have been in 25 years of therapy and they've tried everything. But is there a particular type of thing that you have particular success with or you really like working with?
Well, you'll understand why I don't put this in my marketing because it doesn't sound very appealing, but I like to work with people who are at the brink of just throwing their hands up in the air and saying, "Forget this. I'm just going to be unhappy and overweight and lose my hair for the rest of my life."
Mm.
It's at that point. So it's maybe your people who are determined, they've tried all the practitioners, but then they get so frustrated and they lose hope. I love to swoop in then and give them hope because at the heart, I'm a coach. Before any official nutrition certification, I was a health coach,
Mm.
and I really value that part of my education. I don't think that's less important even than the doctorate or anything like that. I love coaching people through this. I think it's very important, and most people don't get that in many health practitioners' offices.
That's true. Like as I was saying earlier, we are mind, body, spirit, and so much of emotional dysregulation is this spiritual component, not religious necessarily, although people who are religious and have a strong faith tend to do fairly well with anxiety and different types of emotional dysregulation because they have that faith, because they have that idea that there is this sort of power above them that's going to help them. Right. And I think a
Yes.
lot of us anxiety people, when we were younger, we didn't feel we had that power because our parents either were preoccupied with their own shit, and they
Hmm.
couldn't really give us what they needed. So we learned to become, a lot of us learned how to become these lone wolves. Like I'm just going to do this myself. I'm not going to accept help from others. And really, a lot of what comes down to healing, and this is hard to study, of course, is just that connection that you have with that other person, and that other person, that therapist that you actually trust, that
Yes.
will help you. So it's just, and I feel that with you is that, it's a lot about the patient connection. Like, how do we connect almost on a spiritual level? That's a little too woo, but it's just so that they know that you have their best interests at heart, and you know them, and you show them that you know them. And I think that's really important. I used to have this little thing that I would write in the margins of my patient's chart, like trip to Hawaii. I may not see that person for another 2 years, and then I will see my little note. How was that trip to Hawaii you took a couple years ago? And they go, "Hey,
Yes.
you have the most amazing memory." And it's like, yes, I do. I, so, but it's
But
just
that
how do you
stuff
just
makes a
showing people.
difference.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's showing people that you know them, and you're connected to them.
Yes, I could not agree more.
So when you work with someone, and they are in this sort of, kind of throwing their hands in the air, how do you approach that? Like, what do you do blood tests? Do you, like, how do you get your baseline, other than the read that you get when they're talking to you, which is a big read, but what's the next kind of step that you take?
So I'm an economist at heart, right? My first degree, even though not in nutrition, it makes me crave the numbers and the data.
Okay.
And I always prefer doing labs. I also understand labs are expensive and some people are terrified of labs. Either they think they're going to find something not good or they hate the blood draw process or whatever. So I would say about 70% of my incoming clients do choose to do labs, and the other 30, honestly, it's not always this way, but the 30% who generally choose not to, they tend to have a lot more room for improvement in their diet. So they're eating more of the inflammatory diet, which we can talk about what that looks like.
Right.
Maybe their eating habits or their patterns, they're more emotional eating or binge eating, something like that. So I know I can help even if I don't have the data in that case, but I do prefer labs when we can.
Geez, for an economist who can go without numbers, that's a big deal.
I know I've had to change my ways.
Yeah. So is there something you've noticed over the years, like a consistent blood thing? Like, have you noticed that ferritin has dropped? Have you noticed that cortisol, like, is there things that you've noticed just in your practice over the course of the last 5 or 10 years that kind of surprise you?
I would say the things that surprise me are the number of people with insulin resistance, high A1C or blood sugar, potentially even high liver enzymes, indicating maybe the beginning of fatty liver disease, elevated HSCRP or inflammation when they're eating genuinely healthy. So no one eats perfectly.
Right.
And if I saw all those things in someone who's eating, donuts 3 meals a day, I would not be surprised. But the number of people who are eating genuinely healthily
Yeah.
and having those elevated markers always does surprise me and trip me off that something else is going on here.
Right. Now, what about this talk about autophagy, where you don't eat for a certain period of time? Like, some people say intermittent fasting is the best thing in the world. Other people say no, it's not healthy because it does this, and this. Like, what's your idea on that?
Yeah. Well, there is a ton of great research on the benefits of intermittent fasting. And that research is almost always done on middle aged men who don't have other existing conditions, including anxiety, type 2 diabetes,
Mhm.
etc. So now we're actually looking at a very narrow window of people that is not my common client base. I see about 30% of my clients are men, but if they're coming to me, they're stressed or they have type 2 diabetes or
Mhm.
they have a family history of cardiovascular disease or they're high achievers or whatever. Like, they just often don't fit into that category. So what I think is it's always good to get the body resilient enough to where we can withstand fasting.
Mhm.
Fasting is a hormetic stressor. It does make us stronger. However, if we're at capacity, our allostatic load, our stress bucket, as I like to
Right.
call it, is
Yep.
high, that extra stress of fasting is not worth it.
Hmm. Interesting. So what do you think is the biggest intervention that you have with people?
You're going to laugh maybe, but the simplest I honestly think are the best. So the very first is making sure they're getting real nutrition.
Mm,
People are so still in 2024, 2025, whenever this comes out, people are still in the mode of like low calories, stop the bad food, but they're not getting in. And I do air quotes for anyone who doesn't see me because I don't like the word bad as it relates to food, but they're not getting in enough real nutrition. Our
mm,
soil is depleted too. Packaged and processed food doesn't have that much nutrition. So here I'm talking about micronutrients. I'm talking about phytochemicals, like good stuff from plants. I'm talking about an abundant amount of protein, good healthy fats. Yes, even carbohydrates. We're just not nourishing ourselves. So that's always where I'll start. And then I'll move on to things like movement. So for most of my overstressed, anxious clients, that's a Goldilocks effect. People tend to either do nothing or train for Ironmans.
right.
And usually the answer is in the middle. Sleep hygiene, making sure they're hydrated, they're not running on 18 coffees per day. All those foundations are the most important, even though people want to overlook those and get to the fancier stuff.
Right. So are there, just a general supplementation thing that you recommend for most people? Like what about B vitamins? Do you think B vitamins are, an appropriate thing to do for everybody? Like it's hard. I mean, it's hard to say that there's downsides to B vitamins. I mean, I know there's, A, D, E, and K are fat soluble and you can potentially become toxic, but B vitamins basically, what's your opinion on those?
Well, I think we can always make everything a little more complicated. And the downside I would say to B vitamins is a lot of the commercially available B vitamins are not methylated format.
Hmm.
And many people, a high number of people have an MTHFR defect. I hate that word,
That
but
was my
a
next question.
variation.
That was my
What was
next
that?
question. That was my next question about MTHFR. So yeah.
Yeah. So if you know your genetics and you don't have optimal MTHFR status, then you need a lot of methylation support. So that's methyl tetrahydrofolate or methylcobalamin. But that cyanocobalamin, which is in most B complexes that
Right.
you just buy from the drugstore, that's going to make you feel worse. So that would be the downside to B vitamins. But if we're getting the right format, especially if someone has low energy or if they're not eating a lot of animal protein, I don't think there's much downside. Worst case, we're urinating it out.
Right. And getting back to my perimenopausal women with anxiety, is there an approach that you would take to them as far as supplementation goes? Or, is there kind of, the top three that I can
Yeah.
tell from Dr. Lyons?
Yeah. So top three supplements I'll answer and kind of the approach for perimenopausal women. For magnesium and just like for me as a person, magnesium L-threonate is my desert island supplement. It's what I would, if I only could choose one, it's what I
Okay.
would choose. Magnesium L-threonate is great for the nervous system, has a calming effect, but doesn't have the abrasive effect of some other magnesiums and does cross the blood-brain barrier where most magnesium formats don't. So
Mm,
for anxiety, for cognitive function, even research is showing for longer term neurodegenerative stuff, magnesium L-threonate is my number one.
okay.
For most, especially those who are eating the standard American diet, I would do an omega-3. So neuroinflammation, we know, is very connected to
Sure.
anxiety, and most people I see have systemic inflammation as well. That helps, plus helps potentially with the lipid panel and is generally a safe bet depending on medications that people are on.
Mm,
And then I actually do think something for the gut. So probiotic supplementation, we're learning so much about it.
right.
I think we're like at maybe 0.5% of the total knowledge we need. But I do think that emerging research is showing our guts are very depleted based on over sanitization, again, lack of soil quality, lack of fermented foods, overstress, all of that kind of stuff. And anything we can do to boost our gut function, so much of our serotonin's made in our gut. That vagus nerve connection is very strong between our brain and our gut. So supporting that would probably be my third.
What do you think of cod liver oil supplements as omega supplements? Because I've read that they're actually on some levels better than the commercially produced synthetic D2, D3s.
Yeah. Okay. So better than D2, D3. I thought you were comparing to fish oil or omega 3s.
Well, and that too. You know,
Yeah.
have,
So
yeah, go ahead. I'm just asking, like, what's the optimal kind of general vitamin D omega kind of recipe that you would recommend for people?
yeah, so I love that you brought that up because you had asked three, but if I had had a fourth, it would be vitamin D. So that's great.
Yeah.
I think most people are deficient in, or
Yeah.
at least functionally deficient in vitamin D. So the reference range, at least in the US, is 30 or higher. I for sure think that people, especially prone to anxiety, do better at much higher
Yeah.
levels than that.
Totally.
So personally, I try to keep mine at like 70.
Yes.
Yeah, amazing. So that one is great. The cod liver oil, I compare it more to the general fish oil supplement, and cod liver oil does have a really rich omega-3 profile. It also has, depending on the processing, some vitamin A and some other fat soluble nutrients, and it's generally less likely to be contaminated with mercury, things like that. So
Right.
it is more expensive often, but if someone has access to that, I think it's a great addition.
So L-threonate, magnesium, or magnesium threonate, I guess,
Yep.
and cod liver oil, and like I'm speaking specifically to my anxious people because that's the people that mostly like listen to my podcast and listen to me in general. You know, is there sort of a, I know magnesium for sure helps a lot of people with anxiety. And is there any other like kind of supplements that for people that are kind of high strung that seem to help, that you've noticed seem to work?
Yeah. So back to those adaptogens, the Tulsi is a really good
Right.
place to start, or the holy basil.
Right.
Potentially the ashwagandha, depending on the person. If it is part of your question, which I already forgot, now I remember, but I failed to address, was the perimenopausal woman. So
Mm.
if it's something like that, almost always blood sugar dysregulation is in the mix. So I might look into something like chromium or even inositol to stabilize those hormones. That can really help in some cases, but I probably wouldn't do inositol for like a 50-year-old guy. It really just depends.
Right. And inositol is actually, for some people, very anxiolytic. It really helps people with anxiety. It's a subpopulation, but the people that it does help, it really helps. It can be kind of expensive, and you do have to take a fair amount of it. But in some people, it really seems to help them quite a bit. So that's
And I
yeah,
suspect that's because of, I think the mechanism of action where we will learn that that's because of this interconnection. So when inositol stabilizes the sex hormones, now the violinist is no longer going rogue. So
mm,
neurotransmitters related to anxiety can calm down a little bit.
right, yeah, and that makes sense. You know, so I guess it's just understanding that, you know, anxiety, perimenopause, they're multifactorial. I mean, there is, from my perspective, you know, a lot of the people I see had trauma, had wounding, had things that we have to work on. So I my little catchphrase is, anxiety is really a separation of your adult self from your child self, and your mind from your body. You learn to live in the neck up. You learn to that your worrying, distractibility, all that kind of stuff actually protects you from this anxiety, this alarm that you've been stored in your body probably since you were a child. But it runs out of runway.
Yes.
Eventually it stops working. These coping strategies, but we don't stop. You know, I remember a patient of mine saying, you know, Dr. Kennedy, I frankly, I get worried when I'm not worrying, which is
Yeah.
basically the loop that people get into, is that we believe that worry is actually protective. In
Hmm.
a way, in a strange way, if you look at the dopamine circuits, you know, the VTA and the nucleus accumbens, how that works is that when we minimize uncertainty, which is kind of what worry does, worry takes something that's uncertain and makes it more certain. Now, that certainty is often horrible,
Yeah.
but our brain doesn't know that. Our brain says, "Oh, this is more certain, so we should go down this path." So we keep going at the worry, trying to finally suss out or reach that level of calm that worry probably used to give us when we first started worrying when we were younger. So we just keep going back to that well over and over and over again, and it's trying to get people out of that, you know, unconsciously programmed period that it did actually help early on. And it still helps today in a way, in that it distracts you from the pain, but it's really turning towards that trauma that's held in your body, that wounding that's still there. and supporting you nutritionally while you're doing it, because people do not want to do. That's one of the things about antidepressants that I didn't like, is when they did work, people would go, I don't feel any need to go after the root cause of this anymore because I
Yep.
feel better. And I'm, and fair enough, like I think we're both fairly on the same page as far as psych meds go, is that they serve a purpose for sure.
Yep.
But again, they also, the body always finds a way of balancing it out, right? It always
Yes.
finds a way of down regulating certain receptors and that kind of thing. And then you need more of this particular thing. And what I love hearing about in the nutrition side, this is part of my own approach that I like to improve upon, is, what can I do to sort of help people support their nutrition? One of the things that I tell just about everybody is, I want you to go and get like green leafy vegetables every day. And even if you just grab a handful of them and eat them once a day from the fridge,
Yes.
that's an intervention that I read a few years ago that said, even if you just ate kind of green leafy vegetables from the fridge every day, you just took some in your mouth, you're probably doing more for your health in one fell swoop than just about any other dietary change.
Yes. And you know why? Because what are some of the richest sources of magnesium and folate, two of the nutrients we already talked about?
Right.
Green leafy vegetables, folate, foliage. So
Mm.
think about
Oh,
that.
that's a good one.
Anything, leafy, even broccoli, anything green like that is rich in the right form of folate to give us that methylation support. And then anything dark green or chocolate, my other favorite
Okay,
food,
yeah.
or pumpkin seeds, or there are many other foods in magnesium, but dark leafy greens are some of the best. So it's a really great first case intervention. Just like I was saying, get that nourishment in people. Leafy greens are a perfect place to start.
Awesome. So is there anything that you would sort of close out with, anything I haven't asked you about as far as nutrition goes, that you think that we all should be doing?
Yes, I think there are many other things, but I'll give you a couple more. Three more come to mind. Number one, I mentioned briefly, which is adequate hydration.
Mm,
Our body does a whole lot of funky stuff to compensate if we're dehydrated.
okay.
And I know you're not in the US, but 75% of Americans are chronically dehydrated. I'm assuming it's something similar in
Probably.
Canada
Yeah.
and elsewhere,
Yeah.
right? So we need to make sure that we're not just doing coffee, coffee, coffee. I love coffee too. I'm not a coffee hater, but coffee crowds out water,
Mm,
and coffee is a stimulant. And when we have anxiety and our neurotransmitters are wonky, more coffee is not always the answer.
mhm.
So making sure we're adequately hydrated, number one. I would be very wary of food colorings in particular. So Red 40 is getting a lot of attention right now, which has been outlawed in many other developed countries for a long time. But Red 40 is linked to hyperactivity in kids. And yes, it's high quantities, but still, let's try to take out those food colorings in our diet, whether we're a child or an adult. And even if you look at the label and it's like chemical soup and you don't know any of that stuff, it's probably a sign. Many
Yeah.
different things. MSG, we know, has different nervous system alteration effects. There are just so many things. So the more whole foods, the better.
Okay.
And then my last one was blood sugar balancing. So when I'm anxious, I'll
Mhm.
say,
Okay.
I, oh, sorry, what was that?
I said, okay. You're
Yeah.
preaching to the choir here. Let's go.
Okay, when I'm
You're
anxious,
Yep.
I crave sugar. I just feel like I need that hit. I want sugar. Now, what does that actually do to me? That makes me feel good as
Mhm.
my blood sugar is increasing. It's like, oh, yay, all my problems are solved for five
Right.
minutes. And then I crash down.
Right.
And what does that feel like? Even worse anxiety. So then what do I need when I get down there? More sugar or more caffeine.
Yep.
And then the next crash is even worse. And many people with anxiety are doing this over and over to themselves without realizing it, which is perpetuating the cycle. So I really try to emphasize for my clients and myself with anxiety that if you're going to have the sugar, after the meal is better.
Mm.
If you're going to have the sugar, a 10-minute walk after that can really, really help. Maybe we can look for lower sugar options. Maybe we can really front load our meal with protein, fat, and fiber. All those things are going to help our blood sugar stay a little more stable.
Nice. Yeah, I guess it's, just there's so many things out there. Like there's just so many things, but I think nutrition is one of those things that we can, immediately take action on. We don't have to do 50 things at once. So
Right.
we can just start with one thing. And I do notice that my patients that do start with being a little more sugar aware, for one, now that you bring it up, it gives them this sense of control. Like the thing about anxiety is you feel like you're completely out of control. Like
Yeah.
you have no grounding. And in a way, if you look at the pathophysiology of it, you don't have any grounding. You're up in your head. You're not really grounded into anything. And if you start feeling like you have some agency and some control over something, even if it's just one thing,
Yeah.
and even just, and this is what I tell people, it's like, even just being aware, it's like, okay, how much sugar is in this cake? Now,
Yeah.
can I have a small cake? Can I have a smaller piece and just take smaller bites and just
Yes.
enjoy the smaller bites rather than take the big chunk? It's just being aware, like sugar aware, I think is so important, because then you feel like, okay, I am doing this for myself. I am just going to eat, maybe a half of the slice that I would eat before. Now, that's not to say that
Yes.
if you go at it and you have the whole slice on the other flip, you don't want to crucify yourself either. There's carrots and there's sticks. You
Yes.
better, and for a lot of my career in medicine and being a professional stand-up comic and all this stuff, I hit myself with a stick. I would say, you've got to do this, you've got to do this.
Yeah.
I'm sure you can relate. And now, in my 60s, I'm like, okay, how can I give myself more carrots? Like, how
Yes.
incentivize myself to be kinder to myself? Not that I'm really mean to myself or have been in the past, but just taking that mental framework, like, how can I be kinder to myself, and have
Yes.
that and have that be almost a mantra that allows you to kind of make those choices a little more often. You're probably still gonna eat the chocolate cake, the big piece, more often than not. But once you're aware of it, and especially with sugar, just being aware of how that unbalances just about everything. When you're like,
Yes.
diabetes is just such a risk factor for Alzheimer's, heart disease, all this kind of stuff. Just being more aware of that one thing, I think, puts you in charge of it. And then you can make choices based on that.
I could not agree more. And most of my clients are wired like us, where we've been using the stick for far too long. So I actually have access to lots of fancy software for nutrition. And what I start them doing is literally a Google Sheet. I create custom drop downs for their 5 or 6 goals for that week. And if they do it, it turns green and it says yes with
Yeah.
an exclamation point. And they think it's so dumb
Yeah.
and so cheesy and they want the fancier thing. But then they start realizing, oh, wow, I've never celebrated that I hit my water goal today. I've never seen a streak of green for all these days that I went for a walk. And they actually start to like it a lot better than the fancier stuff. And I believe it's changing their internal dialogue too.
And I'm sure it is, because I mean, we're driven by our unconscious. We think that we're conscious beings, but we're not. We're
Yeah.
90% of what we do is driven by unconscious desires and drives that have been there since we've been 5 years old. So
Yes.
once we understand those, we can at least have some sort of actionable way of starting to slowly change it. Because when you slowly change the mechanism, it sticks. If you change
Yeah.
you do it like an acute diet, yeah,
Yep.
you can throw a wrench in there, but it's just your body's just gonna flip back the other way as soon as you finish the diet. And I could talk to
Yes.
you forever, but how do people find you, Dr. Megan Lyons?
So my website, thelionsshare.org, has everything, my podcast, social media, blog, how to work with me, all of that. It's lyons share.org.
Awesome. Thanks for coming on, Megan. I'm sure that we'll talk again, and I appreciate all the information, because this is one of the weak spots in my sort of repertoire, is understanding diet and its impact on emotional stuff. So thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you. And thanks for the work that you're doing and getting this out there. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Megan.